When his friend danced with his cook, the billionaire was consumed by jealousy. Before we dive into this captivating story, we invite you to leave a like and subscribe to the channel to support our work. We hope you enjoy it. The glass of whiskey cracked as it hit the edge of the marble counter, shattering with a dry sound that echoed through the open kitchen of the Caldwell estate. Spencer remained silent, his jaw tight, as the shards scattered across the polished floor like small warnings of attention that refused to fade. He wore a light gray dress shirt, the collar still buttoned, as if he hadn't had the time or the will to relax since waking up. Behind him, the smart wall panels displayed the stock charts of his company, but he wasn't looking at the screen. His focus was locked on the empty space in front of him. Mrs. Hudson, the housekeeper, approached slowly, maintaining the professional posture that 30 years of experience had taught her. "Would you like another, Mr. Caldwell?" He took a few seconds before answering. "No, call the new chef. I want to meet the person you thought was a good idea." Mrs. Hudson didn't question him. She simply gave a signal to the house's digital assistant. In less than 2 minutes, footsteps echoed from the side of the kitchen. Savannah Brooks appeared through the back entrance, wearing a black apron over a simple white blouse with rolled-up sleeves. Her hair was tied back in a practical style, and her makeup-free face held a calm that was hard to ignore. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," she said with a steady voice, no pleasantries. Spencer turned slowly, eyeing her as if measuring every inch of her presence. "You're not what I expected." It wasn't a compliment or a complaint, just a fact. "I'm curious to know what you were expecting." She didn't smile. She simply held his gaze, not intimidated by the scale of the room or the reputation of the man standing before her. "Something less. Los Angeles." She took a step forward. "Maybe that's exactly why I'm here." Spencer grabbed a new glass, poured water, and motioned for her to speak. "Tell me why you took this job. You've worked at award-winning restaurants. Why give that up to be a private chef out in the middle of nowhere?" Savannah answered calmly. "Because I needed a different environment, more intimate, less performance. Because I actually love to cook, not to sign menus that other people execute. And because the salary helps." Spencer raised an eyebrow. Honesty is rare, but useful. Saves time. She shrugged. "And you seem like someone who values time." They stared at each other for a few long seconds. Mr. Kensington, the butler, interrupted the moment with a calm announcement that lunch would be served in 30 minutes. Spencer nodded. "I'll have it on the terrace." Mrs. Hudson hesitated. "Sir, the terrace?" "Yes, the terrace." It was the first time in nearly 2 years Spencer had mentioned that space. Since Lily's death, his wife, he had avoided every corner of the house that reminded him of the late afternoons they used to share there, sipping California wine and making plans for the future. Savannah didn't react to the request. She simply organized the plates, picked the fresh ingredients, and walked to the kitchen with focused precision. The terrace was wide, with a view of rolling vineyard-covered hills and a horizon framed by tall cypress trees. The lightwood furniture was still there, as if waiting for someone who was never coming back. When Spencer arrived, the table was set with a white cloth and lavender accents, a pitcher of cucumber water placed thoughtfully to the side. He sat down and glanced at the silverware arrangement. "You set this yourself?" "Yes. The dishes don't match. That's why I chose them. Nothing matching, but everything in harmony." The first course was a warm quinoa salad with shrimp, avocado, and ginger vinaigrette. Spencer took a bite and remained silent for several seconds. "It's good," he said flatly. "The quinoa is perfectly cooked." Savannah nodded. "I'll take that as a compliment coming from you." He looked up at her. "You have opinions, and you don't back down. I have standards, and I don't fake humility." Her answer wasn't insolent. It was direct. Spencer grabbed the napkin and leaned back in his chair. For the first time in a long while, The discomfort didn't come from the absence of his wife, but from the unexpected presence of someone who refused to follow the script. And that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. When she stepped away to get the second course, Spencer remained seated, his elbows resting on the table, his gaze fixed on the hills beyond. The soft rustle of wind in the plants and the distant clink of dishes created a strangely peaceful atmosphere. He raised his glass to his lips, but didn't drink. He just stayed there, breathing slowly, in no hurry to go back inside, as if that moment alone meant more than many of the days that had come before. Savannah spent the rest of the morning organizing the pantry shelves, making a list of what needed restocking and relabeling the spice jars. Mrs. Hudson came in to collect the empty breakfast tray and, upon seeing her rearranging everything, made a practical remark. "You don't need to go above and beyond." Savannah gave a small nod without stopping what she was doing. The truth was, she felt more at ease when she had control over the details. The silence of the kitchen, the predictable rhythm of the tasks, it all helped her keep her thoughts in order. Working there wasn't part of her life plan, but for now, it was a way to stay busy and away from the questions she still couldn't answer. By 11, she had wrapped up her tasks and headed to the service dining room, where Mrs. Hudson had set aside a small portion of lunch just for her. She ate alone, in silence, seated at a table against the wall of light-colored tiles. In the early afternoon, Spencer crossed paths with her in the hallway, connecting the kitchen to the outer wing. He had just come from meeting in the office and looked more relaxed than usual. His blazer was gone, and the top buttons of his shirt were undone. She stopped when she saw him and waited for him to speak. The risotto was excellent, and the coffee right on time. He didn't smile, but his tone was noticeably softer. Savannah nodded briefly. "If you have any preferences for the coming days, I can adjust the menu. I don't like surprises, but I liked what happened today." The sentence lingered a second longer than it needed to. Then he walked on, and she returned to the kitchen. He hadn't said much, but there was something about the way he paused before leaving, as if he wanted to continue, but didn't quite know how. Later on, Mrs. Hudson stopped by the kitchen with a clipboard in hand and mentioned that Mr. Caldwell would be having a dinner guest. An old business partner, Trent Myers, who had just returned to town after a long stretch in Europe. He's the kind who notices everything. He'll know if a napkin's out of place. Savannah made a mental note and immediately began planning the dinner. She settled on something classic but not outdated. Filet with a mustard and red wine sauce, served with rustic mashed potatoes and sautéed vegetables. For dessert, she chose a fresh fruit tart with a light cream. She preferred working with whatever was freshest in the pantry, without forcing anything. When Mr. Kensington brought up the wine selection from a cellar, she tested pairings carefully, even though she had no way of knowing which would get final approval. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, just do her job the way she knew best. By the time evening arrived, Savannah had everything set well in advance. The main dining room was ready, bathed in soft lighting that warmed the sand-colored walls. She had polished the silverware herself, and the floral arrangement on the table followed the house's usual pattern, but with a subtle, refreshing twist. As she adjusted the final details, she heard footsteps outside. It was Spencer, now in a dark suit, his tie slightly loosened. He didn't say anything, just gave her a glance of approval before heading toward the foyer. Trent arrived minutes later, a charming man with a quick smile and confident presence. Spencer greeted him with a firm handshake. From inside, Savannah watched discreetly. Even from a distance, she caught fragments of their exchange, deep voices, short laughs. The house was slowly filling with unfamiliar sounds. During dinner, Savannah served each course with precision. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but she was listening. Trent complimented the food from the first bite, asking who was responsible. Spencer gestured subtly toward her. Savannah, and then went on eating. When dessert was served, Trent asked for a second helping, which prompted a rare dry comment from Spencer. I don't usually go for seconds on dessert, but I might make an exception tonight. They both laughed, and Savannah, without looking directly at them, noticed the ease in Spencer's voice. When clearing the plates, Trent made sure to thank her directly. You cook like someone who respects the timing of the ingredients. That's rare, she replied simply. It's the only way I know. When she placed the tray on the kitchen counter, she took a deep breath. There were still dishes to wash, but the hardest part was over. It was late by the time Savannah stepped out through the kitchen side door. The garden was partially lit by soft, built-in lights. She paused for a moment before heading toward the staff quarters. The house was quiet again, but not in the usual way. This silence felt more like a pause between moments, not the weight of absence. Spencer was still in his office, as Mrs. Hudson had mentioned earlier. She thought back to everything that had unfolded that day. The food, his glance, the friend's visit, the way he had said her name. Nothing dramatic, but not insignificant either. In a place like that, even the smallest deviations left an imprint. And that was precisely what kept her watching closely, the details. Because that's where change begins to take shape, even when no one says a word. Ever since Savannah Brooks arrived at the Caldwell estate, the days seemed to move at a different pace. Still adjusting to the vast rooms, the hallways that stretched longer than they needed to, and the protocols that, while discreet, were present in every corner, she didn't allow herself to waver. The kitchen work demanded attention from the early morning hours, and even with the help of other staff members, every detail still passed through her hands. Spencer remained a mystery to her. She had seen him only a few times outside mealtime, but he always left the impression of deliberate restraint. He observed more than he spoke. During lunch that day, however, she noticed something unexpected. He had finished the entire dish. A small detail, but in the notes from the previous day, half of it had been left untouched. Savannah said nothing, simply made a mental note. That afternoon, while finalizing the mise en place for dinner, Savannah was called to the library by Mrs. Hudson. Mr. Caldwell wanted to speak with her. She crossed the upper floor cautiously. It wasn't common to be summoned directly. When she entered, she found Spencer standing by the bookshelf, flipping through a book on architecture, though his eyes drifted far from the open page. He motioned toward the armchair across from him with a brief gesture. I wanted to thank you for the lunch, he said, still not looking up from the book. It wasn't an easy dish. Savannah nodded. I tried to work with what we had available. He closed the book, placing it on the table beside him. The kitchen's been more organized since you arrived. Do you like the work? The question caught her slightly off guard, but she answered with poise. I like doing things well, and I like understanding people through what they eat. Spencer studied her for a few seconds, then nodded, as if that logic made perfect sense. Then keep at it. That evening, as guests began to arrive for a small cocktail gathering Spencer had agreed to host at the last minute, Savannah was putting the final touches on the porcelain trays of canapes. There was care in everything, from the selection of flavors to how each dish would be presented. The main hall looked elegant, but not ostentatious, with warm lighting casting soft shadows on the mansion's modern furniture. Savannah wasn't expected to take part in the reception, but had permission to circulate and supervise the buffet. While adjusting one of the side tables, she ran into Trent Myers, a longtime friend of Spencer's. He recognized her instantly. Savannah Brooks. I didn't think I'd see you here so soon. The smile was the same as when they had first met days earlier, during an informal delivery in the kitchen. The house welcomed me well, and the job is pretty straightforward. Her reply was calm, without pretense, which seemed to amuse Trent even more. Still sharp, I see. I like that. She continued working, but Trent's comment lingered with her longer than she cared to admit. She wasn't the kind of woman who got easily flustered, especially in professional environments. But there was a certain ease in his manner that contrasted with the rest of the guests. Later, as she crossed the hallway leading to the inner garden, she saw Spencer standing by the glass door. He was watching the party unfold with a calm but distant posture. Savannah hesitated before approaching, maintaining her composure. "Would you like anything else for the guests?" she asked discreetly. He turned his head slowly. "Do you like parties?" "Depends on the company." The words came without calculation, but with honesty. He held her gaze for a moment, then simply nodded and returned his attention to the night outside. Savannah remained quiet. She had already understood that in this house, listening was one of the most powerful ways to be present. When the evening drew to a close, she gathered the trays and checked the napkin placements with a care that no longer seemed necessary. The room was almost empty, but she was still there. As she dropped off the final tray in the butler's pantry, she crossed paths with Trent again, who was coming in from the terrace holding a half-full glass of wine. "I'm no expert, but I'd say you were more of a hit than the French wine tonight." Savannah smiled, too tired to keep up appearances. "Good night, Mr. Myers." He gave a slight bow, as if rehearsing some old-fashioned gesture. "Until next time, Miss Brooks." As she walked to her room, Savannah didn't dwell on words or gestures. She just felt that the house, little by little, was starting to take on new shapes. Savannah arrived in the kitchen earlier than usual that morning, even though no one had asked her to. The previous night's events still lingered throughout the house, like a subtle scent that refused to fade, even after all the lights had been turned off. She began setting up the coffee station, cleaned the counters, reviewed the delivery list, and in between tasks, her thoughts drifted to the faces she had encountered. Trent Myers, in particular, seemed to have left a curious impression, not because of the way he spoke, but for how naturally he navigated a world that still felt new to her. Over breakfast, Mrs. Hudson mentioned that Spencer had been pleased with how everything had gone. He doesn't usually give compliments, but last night he said the service was impeccable. Savannah nodded in acknowledgement, without slowing the pace of her hands. Her punctuality was expected, so was her attention to detail. Shortly before lunch, Spencer appeared in the kitchen. He was wearing a light cotton shirt and linen pants, a bit more casual than usual. Kensington followed behind him with a clipboard, muttering about reports, numbers, and deadlines. Spencer cut him off. "Save that for later. I want to have lunch here today." The decision caught everyone off guard, including Savannah, who was already preparing the tray to send to the meeting room. "Here?" she asked, more to confirm than question. "Yes." The table in the garden room. The way he spoke left little room for debate. Mrs. Hudson, who had overheard everything from the doorway, let out a barely audible "very well" before walking back down the hallway. Savannah arranged the plates carefully, added edible flowers to the salad, and brought everything to the designated table. When Spencer arrived a few minutes later, he sat down in silence. The meal unfolded with few words, yet carried a surprising sense of calm. That afternoon, Spencer retreated to his office, and Savannah was put in charge of supervising a new delivery of flowers for the main hall. The arrangements, ordered for a private dinner with 2 Canadian investors, arrived in carefully padded boxes. While helping distribute the vases throughout the rooms, Savannah was surprised by the return of Trent, who had come back to the estate for a second business meeting. "Reorganizing the world around here?" he asked, leaning casually against the doorframe with his hands in his pockets. "Just trying to keep the flowers alive," she replied quickly, but without edge. Trent stepped closer, observing the arrangements. "You know, there's something intriguing about you." Savannah raised an eyebrow. "I've heard that line before," usually followed by a questionable comment. Not this time. He didn't elaborate, just walked away. She stood there for a moment, adjusting the final vase. Later, as she set the silverware for dinner, Savannah noticed a different rhythm in the house. There was more movement, but less tension. Staff moved with more ease, and even Kensington seemed slightly more relaxed. That evening's dinner wasn't a grand event, but the presence of the Canadian guests demanded precision. Savannah wasn't the one cooking. Another part of the staff handled that, but she still made a point to check the final plating before anything left the kitchen. When Spencer stopped by for a last look at the table setup, he found everything just as it should be. Mrs. Hudson said you chose the menu sequence. Yes, I figured lighter dishes would be more fitting for the weather. He nodded. Good call. That was all he said. But Savannah understood that in this house, approval wasn't given with fanfare. Later that evening, once the guests were seated, Savannah watched from a distance, simply keeping pace with the service flow. Trent was there again, seated to Spencer's left, chatting with ease. At one point, he glanced toward the service door and met her gaze. He didn't smile or gesture. He just held the look for a second before turning back to the conversation. Savannah withdrew quietly. On the way back to the kitchen, she reflected on how the house operated on codes that weren't always obvious, but she was beginning to understand them. It wasn't just about serving well or performing tasks efficiently. It was about sensing the unspoken, and she was listening carefully. The weeks following the reception passed like a calm but steady tide, bringing subtle shifts to the routine at the Caldwell estate. The familiar silence of the hallways remained, but it was now punctuated by small gestures that revealed a changing atmosphere. Spencer no longer avoided the kitchen in the late afternoons. He would pass through its seemingly random intervals, though they were becoming more frequent. He'd ask about the day's menu, make comments without imposing changes, and, on rare occasions, even mention personal preferences. Savannah, always observant, didn't ignore these details. It was clear he watched her, albeit carefully. And what surprised her most was that, unlike in the beginning, he now welcomed small interruptions without showing any discomfort. Mrs. Hudson noticed the change even before Savannah was willing to admit anything. The housekeeper, always discreet, began delegating more tasks to the rest of the staff, as if she sensed Savannah needed more freedom to move about the house. Mr. Kensington, for his part, had grown less formal when announcing guests, and on at least 2 occasions, Spencer had asked Savannah directly to choose the wine for small private luncheons. She was no longer just the kitchen staff. She had become part of the house's rhythm. And even though no words had been spoken between them about what that meant, both seemed at ease with this new dynamic. One Saturday afternoon, Spencer appeared at the greenhouse where Savannah was picking herbs for dinner. He wore cotton pants and a linen shirt, his spotless shoes in stark contrast with the damp soil beneath him. She hadn't expected him there. "Didn't think you knew this path," she said, her voice light. "Used to come here with Lily. She liked watching things grow." The name of his late wife still carried weight, but no longer with the same resistance. Savannah just nodded, choosing not to fill the space with unnecessary words. He stepped closer, watching her hands work through basil leaves. "You know what you're doing. I do my best." There was a pause. "I like what you bring to this house." The sentence hung there, unresolved, but didn't need to be. That same evening, after dinner, Spencer showed up in the kitchen. She was alone, wiping down the counters. "Still working?" She turned, surprised. "Just finishing up." He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Care for a cup of tea?" The question was simple, but the gesture clearly carried an invitation. Savannah hesitated just enough for him to realize it wasn't a reflexive answer. "Sure." They went to the side veranda, where the night air was cooler. They sat in silence, cups in hand. The conversation was light but pleasant. He spoke about an upcoming business trip, She mentioned the new fruit supplier, the kind of exchange that, weeks ago, would have been unthinkable between them. Later that night, as she collected his cup, Spencer held the porcelain rim for a second longer before letting go. "Good night, Savannah." She gave a slight nod in response, and as she walked back inside, the warmth of the cup still in her hands, she thought about how simple gestures could carry entire meanings. What was forming between them didn't yet have a name. There were no promises, no stated intentions. But the days continued to link together with a quiet ease that was beginning to reshape both of their daily lives. It was early autumn when Savannah was called to the library for a quick conversation with Mrs. Hudson. The housekeeper only wanted to confirm some details for the upcoming week's dinner, but the meeting stretched out longer than expected. As Spencer walked past the hallway, he caught a glimpse of the two of them chatting with quiet familiarity. He paused for a moment, watched them silently, then continued on his way, unnoticed. Later, when Savannah entered the kitchen, she found a bottle of wine on the counter, the very one she had mentioned enjoying during one of their rare conversations. It was sealed, accompanied by a simple note, "For after hours." She didn't smile, but stood there looking at the note a little too long to hide what it meant to her. Spencer seemed to be changing too. He no longer stuck so rigidly to his schedule and, on some mornings, would have coffee in the inner garden where Savannah arranged herbs and flowers for the kitchen. Her presence was no longer just part of the staff. It had become a quiet source of balance in the house. Their encounters continued to follow the same discreet rhythm, but the pauses between their words no longer felt heavy. Sometimes a glance or a simple gesture was enough to speak volumes. On a colder evening, Spencer showed up at the tea room, a place he rarely visited. Savannah was organizing jars of infusions and preparing utensils for the next day. "Got anything for insomnia?" he asked without formalities. She studied him for a moment before replying. "Chamomile with honey might help." She made the tea and served it unhurriedly. They sat at the small table tucked in the corner, away from the windows. The soft lighting made the room feel warmer, and conversation came easily. He talked about the creaking noises in the house that still woke him up some nights. She mentioned her habit of making tea for her mother before bed. Neither of them said too much, but something gentle was exchanged in that moment. The next day, Savannah found a book about advanced herbal infusions on her counter, with a small tab marking a specific page. It was about the calming properties of lesser-known herbs. There was no signature, but she knew who had left it. Later at lunch, as she set down a glass of water at Spencer's table, he glanced up just long enough to acknowledge it, without confirming anything. The exchange was quick, but unmistakable. The following weeks carried on like that. Brief exchanges, careful gestures, always woven through their daily responsibilities. Savannah began spending more time outside the kitchen, overseeing the finer details of the house. Spencer remained reserved, but no longer distant. There was a new harmony between them, quiet and effective. It was a kind of companionship that didn't need declarations, only continuity. That Friday, Mr. Kensington asked Savannah to assist in organizing a private lunch with an American business partner. The formality of the meeting required attention to every detail. During the meal, Savannah was more visibly involved, managing the service with subtle precision. When the guests complimented the balance of the flavors, Spencer simply nodded. "She has good taste." That was all he said, but Savannah heard it. Later that afternoon, as they crossed paths in the hallway, Spencer said only, "Thank you for today." She replied with a faint nod. There were no grand praises, no clear intentions, but the way they both slowed their pace at the same time, just before walking in separate directions, said enough. And even though the halls of the mansion still held their shadows and silences, they no longer felt quite so closed. The celebration for the new international contracts brought a larger wave of guests to the Caldwell estate. And for the first time since she had started working there, Savannah wasn't in the background. Spencer had added her to the guest list. Mrs. Hudson handed her the invitation with a brief smile and eyes that spoke more than any comment could. Savannah hesitated but accepted. On the night of the event, she arrived wearing a wine-colored dress, simple but elegant. Her hair, worn down in soft waves, gave her a different presence from her everyday self. Mr. Kensington barely recognized her when she passed through the front hall. Miss Brooks. The main room was lit with soft, deliberate lighting. Smooth jazz played in the background, and the cocktail service was moving in perfect rhythm. Savannah moved between small groups, observing more than interacting, never forcing conversation. That was when Trent Myers approached. He already knew her and seemed genuinely surprised to see her there as a guest. "Wow, didn't expect to see you away from the kitchen," he said. She smiled. "Tonight, I'm just another polite face in the crowd." Trent offered his arm and asked her to dance. Savannah hesitated, glanced at Spencer, who was speaking with a group near the fireplace, and then accepted. Their dance was poised, with a respectful space between them. Savannah moved gracefully, and Trent led with ease. "You look like you belong here," he said. "I'm just not used to it." "Spencer seems to be," he replied. That made her glance up, but she didn't comment. When the music ended, she thanked him and stepped away. Spencer approached shortly after. "Do you like dancing?" "I do. Jazz or classical. Depends on the partner." He extended his hand. Savannah accepted. The next song began, slower, carried by soft winds and gentle strings. They danced in silence, their steps aligned, their touches few but intentional. "Have you always lived here?" he asked. "I lived in Austin for 5 years. That's where I met my husband." The surprise was visible but measured. "Husband?" "Yes. He passed away 3 years ago. Cancer." Spencer nodded slowly. "I'm sorry." "Thank you." Silence returned, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. When the song ended, he walked her back to the edge of the room, near the windows. "If you need fresh air, the garden lights are still on. I'll keep that in mind." She thanked him. Savannah spent the rest of the evening in light conversations, always keeping a watchful eye on the atmosphere around her. When Spencer said goodbye to the last guests, his eyes searched for her. She was still there, in no rush to leave, like someone just beginning to allow herself to live something new. The day after the party, the mansion returned to its usual rhythm, but there was something in the air that felt different. Spencer began to pay closer attention to Savannah's schedule, appearing in the same rooms with increasing frequency and decreasing coincidence. One afternoon, while she was organizing pantry records, he showed up at the doorway holding 2 coffees and a question. "Would you like to go out to dinner sometime? Away from here?" She looked up, surprised, but not uncomfortable. "I'd like that." 2 days later, they met at a quiet restaurant just outside the city. The conversation flowed easily. They talked about books, cities they'd visited, childhood quirks. Savannah couldn't remember the last time she had laughed so freely for so long. When they arrived back at the mansion, just before getting out of the car, he looked at her, and she held his gaze. No words were needed. Their hearts were racing. He leaned in and kissed her with both gentleness and passion. She responded the same way, and they stayed like that for a while until they finally stepped out and went their separate ways for the night. In the days that followed, the household routines remained orderly, but the subtleties revealed a new rhythm between them. Savannah started showing up more often in the shared spaces of the mansion, and Spencer seemed more attuned to what she said, even in passing. Their connection was expressed through small gestures, a coffee waiting on the counter, a comment shared in passing, a gentle brush of hands in a narrow hallway. Nothing was declared, but everything was shifting. One afternoon, During a quick trip to the local market to check on the week's produce, Spencer went along. It was unusual. They walked side by side down the aisles, discussing types of herbs and artisan cheeses. Savannah was surprised at how relaxed he seemed outside the walls of the mansion. "I didn't picture you picking out tomatoes," she said. "I like knowing what ends up on my table," he replied, simply. In the car on the way back, their fingers brushed lightly over the gear shift. Neither pulled away. That night, while dinner was being finalized by the staff, Spencer appeared in the kitchen. No jacket, his tie loosened. "Got plans for the weekend?" he asked. "Not yet," she replied. "Then let's go out again. Just us." And this time, the kiss came before the goodbye. Later that evening, alone in the library with the lights dimmed and soft music playing in the background, Savannah reclined on the couch while Spencer poured 2 glasses of wine. They didn't talk much. The silence between them had become a comfort, not something to fill. When he sat down beside her, he slid his fingers through hers without hesitation. Their intimacy had settled into its own rhythm. Kisses came without delay. Their touch was deliberate, but always careful. There was no rush. There didn't need to be. What they were building was already more than desire. It was presence, intention, and quiet commitment. And when he led her to his room that night, there wasn't a trace of doubt between them. The next morning, Savannah woke with the soft light slipping through the blinds. She rose slowly, still feeling Spencer's presence beside her. There was no need to speak about what had happened. Everything had unfolded with a natural ease. No hesitation, no rushed urgency. When they saw each other later in the reading room, he simply touched her fingers in greeting. The gesture was brief, but it said enough. Savannah smiled, and they slipped back into the day's rhythm, as if that new level of closeness had already woven itself into their routine. Spencer began having lunch at home more often, something he'd rarely done before. He started asking Savannah's opinions on small matters concerning the house, not as an employee, but as someone whose insight he trusted. Items on the menu shifted according to her preferences. What was forming between them had become undeniable. Mrs. Hudson, ever observant, had eased up on the pressure she usually applied to Savannah. Mr. Kensington remained his usual reserved self, but there was a subtle new layer of respect in the way he greeted her. The entire staff seemed to adapt naturally to what had become evident. There was something between the boss and the chef that transcended roles. And no one, it seemed, had any objections. On a rainy night, Spencer knocked softly at Savannah's door. He wasn't seeking urgency, just her presence. He sat by the bed, gently brushed her hair, and spoke for a while about a book he'd recently revisited. She listened, eyes open, focused. When he stopped, she only said, "I like it when you talk like that," as if the world outside doesn't carry any weight. He kissed her forehead and stayed until sleep overcame them both. The following Saturday, they left early to explore a local artisanal market. Spencer wore a light shirt and dark jeans, looking every bit the man far removed from boardrooms and deadlines. They picked out bread, cheese, and fruit. Savannah found a delicate silver necklace she liked, and before she could make up her mind, he had already paid. A gift. "Something to remember today. Bye," he said. She accepted without protest. On the drive back, they talked about places they still wanted to see. She mentioned the beaches in Maine. He spoke of the vineyard in Napa he hadn't visited since Lily's time. The conversation carried no tension, only the openness of two people who acknowledged their past without letting it shadow their present. That evening, they had dinner in the library. The table was set simply: 2 plates, cloth napkins, 1 candle. Savannah had arranged everything. When Spencer walked in, he said only, "I love what you've done with this room." She smiled. They didn't just eat. They shared something quiet and intimate without needing grand words or gestures. When they said goodnight, he kissed her with confidence and tenderness. like a man reaffirming what was already certain. By then, their relationship was part of the very foundation of the house, and no one seemed to question it anymore. Months later, the household had found a new rhythm. Savannah was no longer seen as part of the staff. She was part of the home. Mrs. Hudson still managed the schedules with her usual precision, but it was Savannah who decided the menus. Mr. Kensington consulted her about table arrangements before every event. As for Spencer, he had become even more present. He shared with her not just the weekdays, but the in-betweens, long, slow Sunday morning coffees, walks through the garden, unhurried dinners by the heated pool. One of those late afternoons, Spencer spotted her sitting under the pergola covered in wisteria, a cup of tea in one hand and a notebook in the other. He sat beside her, watched her for a moment, then said simply, "Savannah, I never imagined life could rearrange itself so gently." She closed the notebook slowly. "Neither did I," he continued. "I don't want to live without this anymore." She didn't answer with words. She rested her head on his shoulder, and they stayed like that for a while. Weeks later, change took on another shape. Savannah began tending the garden, repurposing forgotten rooms, suggesting updates to the household supply system. Spencer seemed to find a kind of relief in this shared structure. Together, they created a space where everyday life moved with a new pace. Their conversations shifted from house matters to the future, to favorite names, to fears they hadn't voiced to anyone else. One day, Savannah entered the library with a positive pregnancy test. She didn't say anything. She simply showed it to him. Spencer pulled her into a firm embrace. "We're doing this together." The pregnancy unfolded smoothly, and the mansion quietly adjusted to the new anticipation. A room in the north wing was converted into a nursery. Savannah avoided anything excessive, choosing functionality and simplicity. Spencer insisted on being part of every step. He attended appointments, chose fabrics, carried boxes. At night, he'd read to her in a low voice, even when she was already asleep. One evening, he said, "After everything, I don't know if I deserve this chance, but I want to honor every minute of it." She took his hand. No words were needed. When the baby arrived, on a calm spring morning, Spencer held his son for a long moment and simply watched him. This wasn't a repeat of something he'd lived before. It was an entirely new beginning. Savannah, tired but serene, watched them from the bed. He leaned in and kissed her forehead. "Everything's right now, in the middle of so much emotion and all the future still ahead." He sat beside her and asked her to marry him. "I want to make our life, our love, and our family official." She smiled and replied, "Yes. For you, I'll always say yes." The wedding happened a few months later, quietly in the garden. Surrounded by lavender and wisteria, it was just the two of them, their sleeping baby, and a handful of close friends and family. Savannah wore a light dress in a soft fabric. Spencer, a white shirt and linen pants. There were no vows, just rings, and the joy they shared. Life at the mansion went on, now filled with the sound of a child's laughter blending into the clinking of spoons against porcelain. Savannah was no longer just a chef. She was the wife, the mother of his child, the woman Spencer had chosen to keep by his side. And he was no longer just the respected widower of the town. He was someone who had learned how to live again, and who had chosen to give love another chance. The end. Let us know what you thought of this story in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from. See you next time.